So I'm Bronwyn Williams, and this is The Small Print. And today we have with us as a guest, Velina Tchakarova. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. And to start off with, we always like to just ask our guests to introduce themselves the way they would like to be introduced on this show.
Good morning, and thank you for having me on your show. It's a great pleasure being with you and discussing my most favorite topics. So I am the director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy based in Vienna. And I have 10 years of professional experience and additionally 7 years of academic background in the field of foreign security and defense policy. My main field of research and work is focused on global trends, scenarios, and risks. So I work with both public and private clients, and I apply an approach that is very much derived from systems thinking and realpolitik.
Fantastic. So this show that we have, The Small Print, is really about equipping citizens and consumers, that is everyday people, to have the vocabulary, the knowledge and understanding about the issues that are unfolding from a policy perspective that are going to impact their lives as citizens and as consumers going forward. So we try to take those complicated sort of policy wonky ideas and make them relevant to people that are going to have to live through the consequences of those choices. And a few weeks ago, we had Ronak Gopaldus, who is an political scientist that basically looked at security risk across Africa. And our conversation there was really about how the African Union is going to be changing the lives of African nation states and African citizens. And very quickly in that conversation, it becomes apparent that geopolitics is exactly that, a global game, and that you definitely can't look at the sort of future of Africa and the African Union without understanding what is going on in the wider world. And that's why we wanted to bring you on, because you obviously have that even more macro perspective of what's going on in the world and how that new world order is shaping up. Because really from our perspective, and of course, geopolitics is not my primary focus. I'm more of a sort of a general futurist and more coming from it more from an economic background too. It really is appearing to us that a new world order is emerging. The world of Henry Kissinger, the way the world was carved up really in the shape of the United States empire's image, is shifting. And it could go in several different directions from here. And from our perspective in Africa, it definitely does seem to us that there are choices to be made as the youngest continent in the world as to what sort of world order, what sort of ideology we want to be aligning with in the future, because those are the choices that we make that are going to define the world over the next century, over the next few hundred years. So my first question to you would be, do you agree with that assessment? Are we having a shake-up in the global world order? And if so, what are those really big macro trends that are unfolding right now?
Well, thank you for this really exciting introduction. And I want to make one clarification, which is that I only provide one specific view. It's what I call this 30,000 feet macro view on the world, on global affairs, which is also based on my global system concept. But this is just one way how to look at global affairs. And you can apply, of course, different approaches, more bottom-up oriented ones that can provide you additional layers of understanding how this world operates. So, like I said, it's going to be very much global system oriented in the next, I suppose, 1 hour of discussion. But on the other side, take these views and assessments as just one way of explaining the world and not as the only and sole truth, so to say. Now, mega trends and global trends are definitely one of my specialty, and I think that we right now are living in the most exciting times ever in the last 2000 years. So given all the different cycles and trends, and I will unpack them a little bit later for you. I think that right now what we are experiencing is probably one of the most, so to say, systemic shifts and changes. And if I take one example, for our audience. As a comparison, if the global financial crisis from 2007 and 2008 was, so to say, the most significant global structural change, so to say, now the global system change is going to actually take place in all relevant socioeconomic networks, and we definitely have no idea what the outcome of these changes will be. We can have some predictions. We can develop some trend scenarios, but we certainly have no idea about the outcome, and this is what makes it so exciting. I would start with a claim that the most unexpected manifestation of the COVID-19 pandemic is definitely the bifurcation of the global order in a way unseen since the Cold War. So since basically the end of the Cold War. So for me personally, it begs the question, is the world witnessing a new bipolar era of global power competition, or is the majority of international relations experts correct by predicting that it's going to be a multipolarity? And I am actually sharing the view that we are going to witness increasingly a situation of global system bipolarity. So I would start with it, with this claim, and now I will give the floor back to you if you want to ask additional questions related to this.
Sure, yeah. So let's talk about that bipolarity. When you talk about that, what is that division that you're seeing across the world? Because it's not as simple as it used to be. When you spoke about the sort of the capitalist world versus the communist world previously in the last century, or we spoke about North and South, or developed versus developing, or East versus West. It seems to me that this new polarity is going to be a little bit more complicated, and the alliances that are sort of polarizing on those two poles that you speak about are going to be a little bit more tenuous. Perhaps they're going to be more sort of interesting bedfellows on either end of the bed, so to speak. So can you maybe just define what your view is? And of course, obviously with the disclaimer that this is a view, looking at how you see that new split shaping up. What is going to be that ultimate division between the two this time around?
Okay, so I would start first and foremost by basing my claims and analysis and assessment on, like I said right from the beginning, a realpolitik approach. Realpolitik is basically a branch of the political science, international relations, global affairs, that actually claims that power politics, power games, and struggle for power, be it global, regional, or national, is the true motor of global affairs. So it's also the main driver now for the systemic decoupling between the United States and China, and is also a main trigger for this kind of global power shift from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific realm. So first important information is that the globalization, which was the last globalization cycle, because right now we are in a deglobalization cycle. So the last globalization cycle prior to the global financial crisis basically created an unintended outcome, which, excuse me, was the interconnection of all socioeconomic networks, which once again were facilitated by the United States together with their allies and partners throughout the last 70 years during the Cold War, competition with the Soviet Union. And once the Soviet Union actually imploded and basically withdrew from the superpower competition, United States could actually facilitate this existent socioeconomic networks on their own, like I said, together with other allies and partners. And this was basically the unintended outcome, which resulted in the rise of China as a second pole of power, or second system of power. Why? Because it was the United States that decided on the entanglement of China within the US dominated networks. It was a decision during the 70s to create counterbalance to the Soviet Union and their satellites. And like I said, the unintended consequence of this decision, of this chimeric phenomenon, which was built for more than 30 years of really unprecedented systemic coordination, and like I said, of unprecedented entanglement within financial, monetary, trade, economic, energy, diplomatic, so basically international organizations, networks. So the unintended consequence of it was that China got this unique opportunity to rise on its own. So of course, China is now seizing the opportunity to become the first Asian global power in the modern international relations. This global rise, and that's the interesting part, was primarily determined by will be primarily determined by the outcome of the current industrial revolution, and also by its capacities to establish own socioeconomic global networks. So these are the two goals right now. And why do I mention the Industrial Revolution? Because this was a decisive moment, so to say, for the United States to win the competition against Soviet Union in the 70s, in the middle of the third Industrial Revolution. This was the decisive element for global power projections. And the very same happened also with Great Britain when they were on their way to establishing global networks during the first and the second Industrial Revolution. So we are right now, once again, in a very unique situation, because all of this is happening in front of our eyes. And we don't know the outcome. Who is going to be the winner of this fourth industrial revolution? Who is going to manage the major technological breakthroughs? And we have these two competitors. So it's an open game. It's very much based on real competition, even though that we are still observing a lot behind the curtains that we have to speculate on. I will stop here because I suppose that we are going to analyze the role of regional powers a little bit later on.
Yeah, exactly. So it's quite interesting what you're saying there in terms of the determination as to what world order, what world view takes prominence going forward. You kind of got to look at those two angles. The one being the competition element or the market-based element, the fourth industrial revolution, like you say, and the other one being the connection element, or more in terms of forming alliances with who gets to play with who, and how can you win people over or force people over onto your worldview. I think that looking at China in particular, they've been very, very successful in quite a short period of time. And a lot of that was, of course, due to their population growth and deregulating parts of their marketplaces. But a lot of those sort of easy wins have started to reverse. So they're getting to the point where population growth is no longer a plus on that column, for example. And a lot of the easy growth that comes from just simply opening up your markets becomes then hard growth that you have to do something else with. If you want to talk about it from an economic perspective, you have to look at new ways to expand. And we're definitely starting to see things like that with China looking to form alliances willingly or less willingly with various different powers across the world right now. So you can look at that in terms of economic ties, in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, or in terms of sort of military sort of noises that are taking place right now. From your perspective, if we are talking about a sort of a two-polar world with a sort of a US world order on the one hand and the China world order on the other hand, who are the sort of collateral countries in between? What are the key alliances that are going to be shaping up to determine those two teams, so to speak? Where is China looking for influence, looking to bring people into that fold to keep that growth going? Because it is so essential to have both the numbers in terms of connections and in terms of the profits themselves that come from industrial growth.
Okay, you mentioned already China's Silk Road, and I will start with actually unpacking this ambitious geoeconomic project that China launched in 2013. And moving from there, I will also explain why China is trying right now to engage with certain countries along the Silk Roads. Now, the Silk Roads, the Asian Silk Roads, we've known from the time of the great Roman Empire, which actually became an empire thanks to its tremendous connectivity, transport and trade routes established from the wider Mediterranean and Northern Africa, Middle East, and then connecting the empire with the rest of the world. So basically nothing new. If we look at the map, what China is right now trying to do is basically creating terrestrial and maritime routes, transport, trade, energy routes. So basically creating its own connectivity. And this goes on the one side through Central Asia and most importantly Russia, but also right now key regional actors such as Iran and even Turkey, connecting this terrestrial connectivity routes with Europe through the Black Sea area. And of course, the final destination is nothing less than the industrial heart of Europe, based in Germany, France, Netherlands, Italy, and of course, United Kingdom, which is of course a very special case. But then again, there is also an alternative route, a maritime one, and an additional terrestrial connectivity goes basically now through Pakistan and opens the gates to the Indian Ocean through the port of Badr. So basically, Pakistan is another key dot on China's Silk Road's map. And the maritime route is nothing less than those still very much US controlled maritime routes that see more than 80% of the global trade taking place on a daily basis, which also go coincidentally along the most important global choke points, connecting Europe, the Mediterranean area, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the wider Indian Ocean, so the Indo-Pacific area. And why are they so important? Because these global choke points are also the ones very much important and significant for food and energy supply. So of course, China will be looking for solidifying its maritime presence in these specific regions as well, because it's very much energy dependent. And specifically dependent on a certain energy supply from these regions. And this is also one way how China can also connect itself with Africa, and then moving forward even to Latin America. Now, along the Silk Roads, like I said, you will find many regional partners that are members, so to say, of different Silk Roads projects. Belt and Road Initiative is actually the new name. Belt and Road Initiative projects. And if you want to find out where China places its most important geoeconomic focus on, you will identify them very easily on the map. Now, looking at the opposite perspective, you will find, of course, at the epicenter, United States once again, trying to come up with new strategies, approaches, ideas, how to engage old partners and win new partners to build a significant counterbalance to this increasing China's presence beyond Asia, beyond the Asian realm. And like I said at the beginning, due to the fact that China is right now in this unique position to become the first Asian global power, I would like to also unpack this a little bit for our viewers and listeners, that you should look at the map from China's perspective, that on the one side, you can build this regional supremacy through these connectivities in Central Asia, but also meanwhile in South Asia and Southeast Asia anyway. So making you a heartland, so to say. I mean, take the example of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was this kind of heartland superpower. And on the other side, you need also to build counterweight to the US dominance in the seas and in the oceans. And how are you going to do this? Of course, you're going to look at connectivities in your direct vicinity. So Southeast China, of course, seas, and then you take the Indian Ocean, the wider Indo-Pacific area, and you start building there. And you're looking for ports also. Meanwhile, there's such ports also in the Mediterranean area. So you basically are looking for opportunities to also build your maritime presence. And what we are going to observe on the side of the so-called Western alliances initiatives, they will be very much US dominated, but not necessarily, because right now we have a lot of regional constellations built around various actors' interests. Take one example, such as the quadrilateral format, which is not a bureaucratized initiative, but it's happening at the highest political level. That means it's also very, very efficient in decision making, and it's quick in taking decisions. And this one is, for instance, facilitated by India, Japan, and Australia together with the United States. We're going to find similar initiatives coming from what is now being described as the Anglosphere of influence, of global influence, basically being based on the old networks of the UK and United States, of course, but with an increasing participation by new regional actors that have now gained more importance in Southeast Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, of course, with India being such an example, but of course also Japan, Australia, and of course some of the European powers will have to take also a decision to be more, to engage in a more particular manner in such formats. But the European powers have also come up with some ideas, guidelines and strategies how to engage more in the Indo-Pacific area.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So when it comes to actually building those networks and those outposts and creating that whole, whether you want to call it the Belt and Road or the Silk Road or whatever America's trying to do from the Washington side of the world, there's really two ways you can kind of persuade your allies to join your version of the future, and that's either through sort of force or through favor, through some sort of persuasion. So I think I want to ask you, what's really the deal on the table for the case of those so-called sort of geopolitical swing votes, the countries that could choose to align with either of these world orders? What is the offer on the table coming from Beijing and compare and contrast with that offer on the table coming from maintaining the US's world order as it is right now? What are the key differences in forming alliances with each of those two sides of the world? I mean, I know from my perspective, to sort of oversimplify some of these things, one of those differences would be that the US-based world order is much more of, say, an equity-based order, whereas the Chinese order is a lot more of a debt order from an economic perspective, for example. Are there more of those points that you could unpack for us? What is actually being offered, or what is under threat from either cooperating or not cooperating with those two different versions of the future?
Well, it's I find it always very striking that, in fact, a lot of experts, but also it's a common view, so to say, go for this line that United States is a hegemon, and I mean, hegemony is of course not well perceived, but on the other side, the direct comparison as if China would be a similar hegemon is something that I find really striking, because one thing should be absolutely clear, that once China gets the chance of global supremacy, that would mean that Beijing is going to be the winner out of the fourth industrial revolution. Is going to decide over global rules, norms, regulations and values, and so on and so forth. And I think that this is something that hasn't arrived in the mind of many people. So of course, the winner always decides over this kind of things, and has an own idea about how the world, how the global system, with its international and regional structures, has to be facilitated. And this has been actually the case for the last 70 years. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States took over and continued with their institutional leverage. So we should ask the question: what kind of an alternative global system facilitated by China would look like? This is always the first question I ask, and I mostly don't receive a clear answer to it. But my idea is the following: I have four vectors when I try to assess this kind of systemic changes. The one is, of course, the political economy, the most important one, the most decisive one for who is going to exercise power over whom. The second is, of course, global norms and rules, standards and values. Of course, that means the whole plethora of international regional organizations, who dominates them, who sets the agenda, and so on and so forth. Then the third one is, of course, alliances, partnerships. How do you forge alliances? With what kind of, as you've asked in the question, with what kind of portfolio? what are the incentives behind this? Absolutely. And finally, of course, the technological breakthroughs. I mean, are you capable of really being a technological superpower? Because without this layer, I mean, technology is only a means to an end, and your ultimate goal is, of course, maximizing your power. Now, going back to your question, first and foremost, I want to stress that the only power with global power capabilities right now is the United States. They are the only state actor capable of projecting global power and capable of actually controlling global supply chains, controlling transport and trade routes, facilitating these networks, or if they decide, they can also let networks collapse. Just to give you an idea, like take, for instance, the global monetary system. The global monetary system right now is actually kept afloat thanks to the Federal Reserve interventions. Okay, so in order to have this global power capabilities, I mean, you certainly need all of these four vectors that I've mentioned. Okay, and China is on its way, but on becoming this kind of second system power, but it's not there yet. Like I said, we don't know exactly whether China will manage to come out as a winner of the fourth industrial revolution. China is still struggling in forging solid and loyal alliances and partnerships. Most of them, as you mentioned, are based actually on incentives derived from the Belt and Road initiatives. Okay, so huge amounts of liquidity are being promised, but the way how China approaches regions and countries is very much different from what, for instance, other regional powers, or for instance, United States do. And you gave an example with indebtedness. Right now, for instance, we have a European case with Montenegro, European integration candidate, that actually has been trapped in this kind of debt question, basically due to the fact that they entered a deal with China, which now they are not capable they are not capable of repaying the loan they took from China for this infrastructure project. So it's definitely a very different way of how China approaches regions. They go, enter, bring in their own workforce, their own companies, build the infrastructure, be it a highway or any other connectivity project, and usually they stay. And now the major question, of course, is, which I raised already years ago, why we should assume that once these infrastructure projects are also being built, they have to be securitized. And of course, this will be done by Chinese, either Chinese private security companies, or we will see boots on the ground at some point, with the explanation, this is a huge infrastructure project, a huge investment for China. So we need to, make sure that this is going to be also a secured project for us. Take the example with Myanmar, where China has energy interests, it has built pipelines, both in oil and gas. Now there are announcements that they have to protect these pipelines because of the situation in Myanmar. And this is something that is going to increasingly be happening, in other parts of the region. What the West has been doing, of course, is that there is this specific layer of norms, international norms, standards, and rules. And of course, you have also the international organizations and structures which facilitate this set of norms and rules. And one major gap which I see is, for instance, or as a potential one, doesn't have to happen, of course, is that European powers are very much linked to the European Union institutions, which of course have their own rule of law, very similar, of course, to the Western ideas, but we have, of course, our institutional layer in decision making, whereas United States and also other partners such as Great Britain and other countries from the previous networks of the United Kingdom have very much this Anglo-Saxon rules and standards and law, and I think that maybe this could be one gap in getting a coherent approach as a counterbalance to China, where you will find that certain countries which are easily dealing with with the Anglo-Saxon way of doing business and getting into new relations and alliances, which is quicker, easier to facilitate, and so on and so forth. Whether the European way of decision making is, as we saw also during the pandemic, quite slow, it's a heavy process. You have two-fold layers, you have the European Union institutions, it's a huge bureaucracy, machinery, and then you have, of course, the European powers, basically the French, German engine behind the European integration, and that makes the process slower, heavier, and less efficient, specifically when it comes to crisis and crisis management. that might be one potential, conflict in the future that will actually kind of create a dividing line between Western partners.
Yeah, that's an interesting place to sort of pick up on there, because I did want to unpack a little bit further with you the role that you see going forward, if it is going to be a China versus US type world, for two particular sort of regional groupings. The one being the European Union, which, as you have indicates, it has its own fragility in and amongst its bureaucracy as to what's likely to happen there, how they're going to end up splitting, sharing power between the different parts of the world. And the other one being the BRICS nations, the emerging markets nations. Are they going to be aligning closer to Beijing, or is there a valid, viable reason why they would reject the Beijing consensus on the future? And I think the big pivots there would, of course, be India, which is probably the only sort of sizable, credible threat to, that even has the ability to resist a sort of an offer based either on fear or force or favor coming from Beijing right now. So maybe you can just unpack those two as separate ideas. I know you've spoken a bit about Europe, but what happens with Europe in this bipolar world? And then what is likely to happen with the emerging markets? And we can just talk about the BRICS, because obviously emerging markets is a huge thing, but I'm quite interested in that bigger global picture rather than just what's going on around China, South Asia Sea.
Well, from a geopolitical and economic point of view, I see this new great game emerging and being predominantly situated in the Indo-Pacific region. This is why I called it also the Indo-Pacific decade. So countries that are situated in the vicinity of the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, are going to witness this kind of rising competition between the two Asian giants, as you mentioned, basically China and now India, with India being projected to becoming the third economic power in the world in the next decade, probably even quicker now with this new kind of acceleration of partnerships with United States and other like-minded countries. And that means, of course, that most of the hotspots, most of the triggers are going to be to take place also in these areas. So you take South, East China Seas, you take Indian Ocean, you take the Mediterranean, the Caspian, the Black Sea, you take the North African, the East African coast, you take Middle East, and this is what I call the gray zone between two systemic rivals, and their blocks and partnerships, alliances. So all these kind of tensions, not necessarily only military tensions or conflicts, but also all the full spectrum of competition and rivalry and conflicts is going to be observed more or less in this gray area. Now, going back to your question, how China is approaching alliances, and then of course the role of BRICS. If I correctly understood you, you want to specifically know more about the BRICS. I hope that I acoustically got it.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Well,
India, Russia.
Yes,
South
of course.
Africa,
So of course, like in nature, states are also mimicking very much what's successful formulas. And like I mentioned, these four vectors where you can actually see how the systemic rivalry is taking place, and they are very helpful to assess the ongoing shifts and changes. The one which is based on international organizations, regional organizations, is quite indicative of what China has been doing in the last 10-15 years, basically mimicking the United States institutional leverage and trying to create alternative institutions, alternative structures, because you cannot facilitate socioeconomic networks without having the structures for it. You need the regional platforms. So BRICS was such an example where China basically, came together with Russia, with India and Brazil, and then South Africa was also added to this platform, where they actually wanted to provide kind of an alternative regional platform for discussion of global issues and international affairs. Of course, the motivation for each of these countries was very different. But the Chinese idea is, and meanwhile they have been very successful in facilitating such international organizations that are an alternative to an existent American US-led one, or international organization in every domain that you could think of. I mean, take finance, take monetary, take energy, take trade, take economy. You have them everywhere. So you have also the banks that are very much alternative, like should function as an alternative to leading American institutions, like take the Asian Bank for Investment, the AIIB, right? And we have, of course, already an existent example with the Asian Development Bank, which is an American project. Just to give you one idea, okay? So BRICS was nothing less than just an idea how to start facilitating alternatives to American platforms, where China can set the agenda, of course, with other important regional actors. I still think that it's an important platform specifically to address, for instance, the tensions between China and India, which will going to increase in this decade. But they, for instance, managed to derive from it another platform, which is basically a trilateral format with the foreign ministers of India, China, and Russia. Okay, so you see also how they are already partners being put on the sidelines, and then you have, of course, at the core, you have China and then Russia. And of course, now India is increasingly realizing that it's losing ground on these platforms because of the realities on the ground, which are, like I said, increasing likelihood of tensions, military tensions, military conflicts, and even hopefully not, but likelihood of a more serious conventional military conflict between the two Asian powers in the direct neighborhood. So India is also increasingly realizing that Russia is taking quite of a neutral stance and is trying to oscillate between them. Of course, on the one side, having very good traditional partnership with India, a lot of business relations, Moscow is selling still a lot of arms to India, military equipment and so on. On the other side, India realizes that now there is a systemic coordination between China and Russia, which they do not understand and are very, very much worried about. And specifically because it's still not clear where it leads to. Okay, so will it be at some point a systemic coordination also in strategic domains? Take military affairs, take space, take surveillance technologies. There is a lot of potential. So the dragon bear is this kind of unpredictable unknown component in this equation. But for China, this kind of formats, another one is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, where India and Pakistan are already also members. Iran has an observatory status. Central Asian countries are also being part of it, and China is facilitating the organization together with Russia. you see how they are trying to mimic, and it's a copy-paste method, like I say, but on the other side, why not? It's a legitimate approach if you see that something works and has been working quite efficiently in the past, like it was the case with US organizations, in the leading ones. Take the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, then move to the, to all these the networks. Why not introducing something alternative where you need to take all, to basically bring all of these decision makers together to let them know what your agenda is. And this is happening. And by the way, it's also increasingly happening at the level of United Nations. And it's under organizations, and is also being observed now as a phenomenon at the level of the United Nations Security Council.
Yeah, exactly. But there's also sort of an argument to be made of China infiltrating some of those established global institutions that are at a higher level than they have previously. But I suppose just to ask that same sort of question, but in a slightly different way, if you take a very large, very macro view of humanity, you can kind of see the sort of balance of power generally seems to have shifted away, following the same patterns as our demography, really. So, we had like the sort of Western era, sort of that center of gravity, just of the critical mass of human beings, moved towards China, it's moving now towards India, and then on to Africa in terms of just pure demography, just pure numbers of people and where that weight really lies. So I suppose if we're taking a bit of a longer view on that, then the questions do then become India first and then Central Africa second, as to, is India likely to be a friend or foe to China's plans going forward? Because you've given a couple of examples of both where they are both aligning and showing some signs of conflict. And then further on, Africa. Is Africa friend or foe to the Western or more China-based visions as to where we're heading? When we take that sort of chain as to where all the people are going to be and where those sort of critical pivot points of the future come from, which side do you see those two balls bouncing? And obviously it's probably easier to talk about India because their critical mass is coming to the fore a lot faster, like you said, in terms of the economy, in terms of population growth, and all those very tangible power levers that countries get to play with for a very short space of time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think India is probably one of the regional players that has already taken a side, which I think is also very interesting to observe as a phenomenon, because during the Cold War, India has been part of the non-alignment movement. It has been a leader of the non-alignment movement, has facilitated it, and there was as a third option. Now, I think that there won't be a third option, such as oscillating between two system powers. I mean, I think that at some point, all relevant regional actors are going to have to take a decision, and they are going to have to take a side. And so far, we are observing very similar behavior with a lot of relevant regional actors that try to capitalize by playing off the two countries, the United States and China, against each other, and basically capitalizing on both sides by making business with China, but then again being a security partner of United States. For now, from this transitional period, this oscillation, this equidistance strategy, it's not even a strategy. I call it a tactic, because it can be only short-term oriented. You cannot really gain by applying equidistance, not taking sides. At some point, you run the risk of being squeezed by both, for not being loyal to the one, and for not being predictable for the other. So this is the case now. For instance, take Turkey. I mean, in the case of Iran, this is very much a different situation because Iran is absolutely dependent on Chinese liquidity and Chinese support, and even it's a very intriguing situation because, in fact, Russia and Iran are regional rivals when it comes to energy supply, when it comes to controlling Syria, and still Russia very much supports Iran because of the building a counterweight to the United States dominance in the region and beyond. So you see how fluid these geopolitical considerations are. But Russia is I think the most important case of a new kind of free rider trying to capitalize on its immense disruptive power, maximizing its quite limited options in various geoeconomic domains, and still having a solid, strong card, when it comes to reconfigurations, geopolitical reconfigurations. So this is an open question mark still, even though that I have outlined this geopolitical term, the dragon bear, for the last 7 years, a kind of systemic coordination between the two countries in key fields and domains. I still claim that it's an open question mark. And then you see that you have both Western partners trying to oscillate, and the typical example is also the European powers. I mean, the continental European powers, to be more specific with you, Germany, France, so-called European Union core, they are also oscillating. They are trying to go for this, equidistance approach. Let's have nice business relations with China. We are the nice European partners. We will be left alone. We will be not bothered. And at the same time, we are still this, very, very loyal partner of the United States. It's not going to work out in the long term. So absolutely no. And the same goes for other South Asian partners. And I think this is the key, because you mentioned something very important, and that is how global power is shifting now, from Euro-Atlantic, from the Euro-Atlantic realm towards the Indo-Pacific realm, where the most of the demographic shifts change. I mean, the growth in terms of demographics, but also in terms of economic power, in terms of trade power, is going to happen. So there will be a lot of regional partners, and we're already observing this phenomenon, right? Where you will find these oscillation strategies because out of necessity, because the pressure is too big. When you have a really big Chinese presence in your direct vicinity, you have to be probably more careful, more tactical. But then again, we will observe a new unimagined before alliances and partnerships. And I suppose that, like I said, the really most exciting moment, and which is going to be a new moment, is that India is not going to be you cannot be a third world power and at the same time a leader of alignment movement. You will be faced with a reality where you have to take decisions. And I think that we are going to observe this kind of new American-Indian, it doesn't have to be alliance. Yes. And around that, the eastern coast of Africa is going to emerge out of this geoeconomic space as a huge playground for the conflicting interests of external actors. Yes. But this will create also immense opportunities for this region, and of course this goes up to South Africa. So that's the big question mark for South Africa, how they will forge these regional partnerships in order to prepare for this Indo-Pacific decade.
That's a great point to pick up on over there, because Africa is chance to sort of actually influence things on the global geopolitical stage is still coming. At the moment, Africa doesn't have that much bargaining power when you're talking about these very, very big players that we've been speaking about today. But that is going to change further down the line when we start getting towards mid-century, when Africa's population is going to be, of course, increasing. Nigeria is going to be taking over. It's one of the world's most populous countries, and all of those sort of crows come home to roost, so to speak. So this might be a slightly unfair question, but I think it's definitely worth asking, particularly for people who are listening to this call. And that is, what should Africa be thinking about? If you are an African citizen, if you are an African nation state leader, if you are sitting, like you mentioned, on that sort of east coast of Africa, those trade routes where things are going to start getting quite interesting over in the sort of near term, not even the very, very far term. What is the advice that you could give to both citizens and leaders in that region in terms of playing geopolitical cards to set that region up to have more power, influence, and control over its own destiny by the time we get to mid-century? What are the sort of questions to avoid, and what are the opportunities that could be played right now? I think I mentioned at the beginning of the call that Rona Kapaldis, who does look at this from an African perspective, so geopolitics but Africa-centered, does tend to feel quite strongly that Africa needs to pick its alliance partners quite carefully now, and that the world orders on offer from those two polar opposite views offer very, very different consequences for the continent. And as the African Union is becoming something that might actually happen finally and have some sort of influence, what are the choices facing Africa, and what are the smart choices, and what are the less smart choices that are going to end up, giving away more power than should be given away in the region going forward? Because obviously, given Africa's history with colonization and all the rest of it, it is a question on the top of a lot of our minds who live in the continent to see how Africa can have more agency over its own destiny at least, but it would also be nice to have a bit more influence on the global stage.
Yeah, that's such an exciting question. And I am so afraid that I might sound cynical due to the fact that I always present this really cold-blooded realpolitik, perspective, which kind of also reflects, a division between what I personally perceive and personally have as, values and ideas, and what my expertise is, which
give
now
the objective view.
Today the expert, I want to clarify once again, it's only the expert talking right now. So I present you ideas, I present you trends and assessments based on my expertise, not on my personal views and my personal values. Okay, so that's very important to say, because what I'm going to say now is very, cynical. So it's, you mentioned Africa is the youngest continent, but Africa is also the richest continent in the world in terms of natural and mineral resources, and that's not really a good thing, because it draws the attention of all literally powers, global and regional ones, that will seize any opportunity, will fill any vacuum they find to place themselves in the game, and to exploit opportunities. So in addition to that, Africa has nearly 600 million hectares of uncultivated arable land. Another bad news, because you understand what this means. This is more than 60% of the global total. And in terms of environmental degradation, which is now even being more and more accelerated by the day, and in terms of climate change, in terms of all this, of all the deterioration of ecosystems, that means a hunger for, uncultivated land, because food, energy, water, this is the oil of the 21st century. Okay, specifically,
real resources again.
This is the real game. So this is no good news for Africa. Of course, it would have been good news if Africa has had these strong countries, countries with strong institutions, with, strong state building and good governance, and all of this, that actually the majority of African countries, of course, there are excellent exceptions, but are still not there yet. Okay,
so to quote our constitutions at all.
Yeah, to quote an African leader, I don't remember the name, but maybe our viewers can find it on the internet, but once said that global players will always come, take and do whatever they want with the resources of Africa, which is unfortunately the cold reality facing this continent, but also it's the way how the world operates and works. So Africa is by no means an exception. The scale is just different. It's an immense scale. So what I'm looking at in this particular case is, of course, who controls the natural resources. All global players, regional players, so globally oriented players and regional players are already there. So you take United States, China, Russia, you take European powers, you take the Middle East, Gulf powers, and you take, meanwhile, you have, of course, also increasing presence by other Asian powers. India is placing itself already in certain African countries. And that's the reality. And this is just the beginning of a new kind of reconfiguration. And scramble, exactly. Then you take into consideration the fact that the majority of armed conflicts is still very much, unfortunately, so armed conflicts, international terrorism, conflicts and tensions linked to military issues is taking place on the African continent. And of course, against this background, anything related to fourth industrial revolution breakthroughs, how to ride the wave of the fourth industrial revolution from an African perspective, from the point of view of an African country, is increasingly complicated, right? So the good news is that I think that right now, what might be an advantage is you don't have to catch up with the third industrial revolution. So basically, I think they're going to skip. Some of the countries are going to skip some stages of economic development, and they are going to immediately jump on the new ones. So basically, trying to exploit opportunities of digitalization. And due to the fact that Africa, as you said, is the youngest continent, that might be a huge potential if there are more bottom-up initiatives which are dedicated to, more engagement with this young population. And if you have the technological tools for that, if you use the digitalization advantages, you can actually create new business opportunities for broad ranges of young people that are do not take place in this classic understanding, as like I said, we saw it from previous industrial revolutions. So that might be an advantage, and I think this is the good news. I want to end with instead of leaving a bad taste in your mouth by being too realistic about certain realities on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot to be said that this fourth industrial revolution doesn't have quite the same impacts on getting people out of poverty and into, the marketplace. And the third industrial revolutions, just due to the nature of the sort of businesses that are being built and how we're no longer getting that sort of like diminishing marginal returns. You're actually talking about increasing marginal returns that end up concentrating wealth rather than distributing wealth. It's like that trickle-down economics doesn't work quite so well with fourth industrial revolution type business models. I mean, we've seen, I mean, just everything is based on economies of scale and network effects. So there are quite big disclaimers there that Africa is coming of age in a very different point in time in history to when China and India and Southeast Asia have been able to do that. A time when the world is moving into a different sort of cycle of the super cycles, both economically speaking and politically speaking, it could set it up for a lot of challenges. But I think that's how we want to have these conversations. We have to understand what is at stake here and just what we're up against. If we're not being realistic about the world order that we're working into, we can't take smart decisions. Foresight does require having a basic understanding of just what the problems are, how big they are, and what you're going to be coming up against. So I think that you have done a very good job of articulating that. My challenge to people watching this is to not be complacent about it. The world order, whether it is a Beijing consensus or a Washington consensus or an Indian idea of what comes next, is not designed for Africans by Africans. It's not designed for the benefit of the continent. So if we want to have agency, as I said, within the next sort of 50, 60 years, when the sort of center of gravity will be shifted back to the continent, we have to be starting to make foresights of decisions right now. We have to be planning for longer term gains and not for sort of short term wins, which is, of course, hugely challenging when you're dealing with political leaders that have very short-term bias, that have very selfish motivations and very weak institutions that actually facilitate graft more than they facilitate, progress in the continent. Not to be too cynical once again, but I think that if anyone that lives in Africa is quite aware of these short-term problems, what people are perhaps not aware about is how these short-term problems translate into another century or two of being left behind rather than being agents of creating and being participants in whatever the new world order is going to look at. So I have kept you for about an hour today, but I do just want to ask like maybe one more question at the end. So when it comes to the sort of, as I mentioned, the sort of super cycles of history, you have spoken about how we're definitely living in interesting times right now. So it's a great time if you like a bit of chaos, if you like a bit of change. It's not a great time if you're someone that likes things to sort of stay the same. Could you maybe summarize in your view what the cycle that we're moving into is, once again, just to sort of close this conversation up, to say, what are we moving away from? What are we moving towards? So what is that macro trend period ahead for everyone from a global perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yes, maybe just because I skipped one very important component regarding Africa, and I really want to sound more hopeful rather than pessimistic and negative. Think also in terms of connectivity, because if you take the example of the European Union, 70% of the European Union trade is actually being conducted within the own borders, and due to economic integration, and it's actually being conducted between direct neighbors. So if you take this example for the African case, more integration, more connectivity projects between African countries, creating more opportunities for trade, and like I said, connectivity projects is such a comprehensive term. You take transport, you take trade, you take sustainability, the green corridors, amazing project. So you take all these kind of various connectivity ideas, but between and apply them between on direct neighbors. This creates opportunities. This creates much more opportunities than thinking of globalized trade. Trading with another power that is 3,000 miles away. That's just an idea.
Supply and demand, yes, internal.
Yes.
Resilience, because you don't get that's the trade-off with globalization, that efficiency versus resilience. In order to build resilient markets, you require a local consumer base and a local supply chain that remains on continent if you want to build deep resilience going forward, or any sort of bargaining potential in a global context. I think that people are starting to realize that now. I think that's one of the few sort of good things to come out of COVID, is that people have understood the importance of local resilience in times of turmoil or interesting times.
Absolutely. So I wanted really to end with an optimistic note, and I think that this kind of why not African Silk Roads? You know, you have had such with the Roman Empire. This is something what European powers are now also trying to revive, new connectivities along old ancient roads with specifically Northern Africa, but other parts of Africa have also had their chance, you know, in facilitating digital also connectivities and so on and so forth. Just wanted to really, it was really important for me to give a kind of a still optimistic view about the future, despite some harsh realities on the ground. Now, moving to the cycles, we have, quite a dark picture at the moment in terms of cycles. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning the 2000 years cycle, a really important one, which outlines and gives us an idea how global power competition is shifting from which part of the world to which. And right now, obviously, this is the case. This center of global power is moving towards the Indo-Pacific region. That's the 2-year cycle. Now, if you take the 100-year cycle, and just 100 years ago, there was a really, really tough time for the international community, for the states, because of the Great Depression and because of what then ended eventually in the First, Second World Wars. And right now, we are also in a similar situation in terms of a cycle, where there is already the talk about a new Great Depression. Inflation is already appearing. Take food, surging food, energy prices. There are unique approaches right now, monetary approaches to stimulate global economy. Initiated mostly by the Federal Reserve. And also by other central banks. The question is whether this kind of quantitative easing tools are going to really,
help or postpone the inevitable.
Postpone the inevitable, exactly. The fear of hyperinflation. Of course, this is something that will hit first and foremost the underdeveloped economies. So, emerging economies, basically developing economies. So it's going to start there and then moving, with the butterfly effect towards the developed economies world. And that is why it's going to be felt much, much stronger in these parts of the world where they are
much
already
more integrated than it was in the 1920s, 100 years ago. So whatever happens is much more systemic these days. And you're not able to insulate yourself.
This is the reason why I also said at the beginning that we might witness the first major systemic crisis. I mean, I wanted to stress particularly the fact that the great financial crisis was not a global systemic crisis, was a global structural crisis. But if you look back what happened afterwards, nothing really changed. I mean, the structures remained intact. The too big to fail have become even too bigger to fail. So nothing has changed. So the structures remain.
The same play. First act, same play. We're still there.
And we're still there. But right now, we don't know whether this kind of cycle won't result in a situation. History never repeats, it only rhymes. So I'm not claiming that we are going to enter a same scenario of global war, World War III or something like that. But we have all the ingredients for a major global systemic crisis. And like you said, due to the connectivity of the world, due to the fact that these networks have been interconnected in a speed and in a scope unimaginable 100 years ago. Now everything is accelerating, is happening much faster. Then you take the cycle of industrial revolutions. This is another cycle, and you have like right now we are in the middle of this fourth industrial revolution. We don't know the outcome of it. If somebody is telling you or is trying to predict who is going to win, I mean, it's just it's just a lottery, because we are really going to find out, I suppose, in the next. At least in this decade, it's going to we are going to get a more information on the trends and probably a clearer picture where this is heading to. But take space exploration, take technological breakthroughs in key security and military domains, then take all the cyber physical systems, automation, so artificial intelligence, all of these areas, and you clearly will find out that there are always these kind of two competitors, and then regional competitors are also trying to catch up in certain domains. So it's going to be really a very close competition. And then you take the cycle of globalization, deglobalization. And right now, I mean, following the great financial crisis, we have been in a situation of a cycle of deglobalization cycle. So it was already prior to COVID-19 pandemic that the global economy was, was in a phase of slowing down. Recessions signs were already there. The global trade was also in a stagnation phase. So this was actually a cycle that has already been taking place and now has been accelerated also by the pandemic. And you see this now being reflected in the debate on global supply chains, right? I mean, the decoupling also of global supply chains. So there will be more, to it, moving away from China, reconfiguring, onshoring, yes, and I think these are the key dimensions to follow in terms of shifts and trends.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree. So it all sort of comes down to around about the same time as the 2008 sort of financial crisis. Around about that same time, those three big global trends all seem to sort of reach their maximum point and then sort of start turning in the other direction. The three that I referred to that I've spoken about quite a lot would be, of course, sort of free markets, or the sort of capitalist project, which is obviously was under strain when you have massive global sort of economic crises. That was a sort of inflection point there. The next one being, as you say, globalization has seemed to have pulled back from that point. We have seen more sort of regionalization, more reconfiguring of the global world order. And the third one, which is perhaps the most concerning of all, is the pullback of social freedoms and the democracy project at large. So we've seen the sort of reversals in trends as sort of free governments across the world, more concentration of power in fewer hands, more totalism, even in the West. This is not, of course, a sort of standalone sort of critique of any one particular country. And I think that the last year, what we've all seen with COVID have just accelerated all three of those trends and have brought us to sort of another point in the cycle of which we're going to see another inflection bounce off in some other direction into as you said, an interesting future ahead as those three threads intertwine and bend in new directions once again. But as you say, history doesn't repeat, but it does have quite a rhythm section going on, and there are patterns that we can follow, and there are directions that we can follow from here to there. So I think it is important for people to understand that things like the end of history are not exactly an end. It's just an end of a particular era, and we are definitely heading towards some sort of a new era, for better or for worse. And hopefully people who are listening to this call today understand a little bit more about the stakes in play, the players in play, and the directions we're tending towards. Of course, none of this is inevitable. There are an awful lot of wild cards on the table. We've spoken briefly about Russia and India and even Europe, all of which can pull certain strings that can tip the balance in certain directions. And Africa should not count itself out of this. I think Africa, as we've alluded to, needs to understand its own longer term strength and to get organized so that it can become more of an influencer as to what the new world order, the next set of patterns, is going to look like. But I just want to thank you so much for your time today. If you've got any more closing words, otherwise I will let you go and get on with your day, because I've definitely kept you over time.
No, absolutely. I'm really delighted that we could actually cover most of the really significant trends and phenomena in around an hour, which is quite a challenge for such topics. I want to draw your attention once again to one specific process that I'm observing very, very closely, and that is the disconnection between, regional, so basically between state actors. Now let's leave the scale aside. State actors when it comes to connectivity projects. So once they start alienate themselves, don't see incentives in cooperating together on infrastructure projects. Take transport, energy, whatsoever. That's a signal. That's a really worrisome signal that might tell something about the global affairs. So we should very much pay attention as to how this kind of connectivity processes are now going on. My optimistic scenario is how I want to enter this conversation. My optimistic scenario is that the incentive to go into war, into a direct military conflict, which was the case prior to the First World War, basically because the rivaling powers didn't see any more incentives into engaging with each other on connectivity projects, railroads. I mean, during that time it was about railroad projects. And right now, my optimistic scenario is that the incentives to go into a direct confrontation, military confrontation, are really low, thankfully, to the fact that most of the states are in a similar situation due to the pandemic. So they basically agree on a kind of a systemic coexistence. And this systemic coexistence would be facilitated by alternative networks. So they decide to build their own connectivities, which are alternative worlds. And we will probably face a situation where we will have two alternative worlds. And you mentioned surveillance. At some point, the countries will have really to decide whether they can go along with this kind of state surveillance and societal surveillance at global scale, or fight back. So I think that this is the optimistic scenario: systemic coexistence, alliance of democracies, like-minded countries, facilitating their own connectivities, infrastructures, with like-minded partners, alliances, and then you have totalitarian, authoritarian regimes that do not see these incentives. They need still to control their own population, and they have the incentive of building alternative, networks.
Yeah, exactly. And we haven't even touched on the sort of the geopolitics of cyberspace as we start talking about the metaverse, but that's a whole nother topic of conversation.
Absolutely.
It's very, very interesting, the whole sort of connection of the medium and message layer of the world, and how, technology is becoming a super governance that is not, beholden to any sort of geopolitical borders, but that is a different layer on the playboard. So we won't dive into that today. But what I am going to ask you is, if people do want to engage with you, if they want to work with you, where can they find you? How can they get in touch?
Oh, thanks. So for anyone who is interested in my work or in my analysis assessments, you can easily find me on Twitter, and you will get there also all information. You can also find me on my, so I have my personal webpage, which is velinatchakarova.com, and also you can find me on my professional webpage of my institute, Austrian Institute for European Security Policy, which is AIES.at. So I'm really easily to be found, and I would like to use the opportunity to draw your attention to my latest publication, which might be also interesting for the audience, because I deal with the question: is Cold War 2.0 inevitable? I won't give you the answers. You have to read the paper. And you can find it also on Twitter, or you can find it actually at the webpage of ORF Online, which is the biggest think tank. Observer Research Foundation is the biggest Indian think tank, and right now they are organizing the biggest global event with a lot of stakeholders, and they have the Raisina files there where this publication has been published.
And aren't you also launching a course pretty soon on a web-based course, also dealing with some of these issues?
Well, I wanted to remain very modest and not occupy this space by
I don't have to be modest.
self-advertisement. But I have developed the idea to make this kind of analysis more available to everyone who is just interested in these topics. So there is no need for advanced knowledge or any preparations. And I'm launching now a monthly geopolitics class, which is digital. It's going to take place in my digital room. And it starts on the 26th of April at 8 p.m. Central European time, which is also South African time, or 2 p.m., which is 2 p.m. Eastern time. If you want to subscribe, it's really absolutely affordable to everyone. So students from all over the world should have also the possibility and opportunity to get in touch if they want to attend the course. And in this 2-hour session, we are going to discuss all these topics that we have discussed with you in the last 70 minutes. Or I think even longer, and address all these issues, and it's going to take place once a month.
That's absolutely fantastic, because that's the whole point of why we have these conversations, is to get more people engaged with the decisions and the big ideas that are shaping the world around us, because all too often these conversations are had behind very closed doors and not even in public domain at all. But thank you so much for your time today. I'm going to end this call, and we will definitely stay in touch.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the wonderful questions and for the opportunity to discuss with you also all these relevant trends. And good luck to your really amazing platform.
Thank you.